Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to see all of you.
Yes.
So we're going to give a few minutes for our participants to join this evening, but as an icebreaker question, we're going to go ahead and just open it up for a conversation and ask if anyone has noticed any wildlife sightings on the island over the past few weeks. And feel free to unmute yourself.
We've had a western tanager pair and 2 pairs of evening grosbeaks at our feeders last week or so, which has been really awesome. I think they might be nesting nearby, and some black-headed grosbeaks.
That is cool. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Helen.
We have a pretty steady stream of eastern grays and Douglas squirrels, and 1 rat with 6 babies. And lots of birds, lots of finches, crows, towhees, juncos. We did have pigeons for a while, but I kind of discouraged them and made it difficult for them to get the feeder. So, but yeah, it's kind of a zoo out there at our house.
I have a bird bath, and I've had as many as 8 finches in the bird bath at one time.
Wow. Very cool.
I've seen swallows both during COVID testing inside the Commodore and also in our grow community.
I forgot to mention the deer. They're pretty regular visitors too.
I met with a friend, and she said she watched a coyote walking down the road this afternoon by Fort Worth. So,
Cool.
and I have lots of coyotes where I am. I'm on Finch Road Northeast, and this is one of their regular stops. I also had a very large, very healthy young buck in the yard yesterday with velvet beginnings of antlers,
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, so it is 6:03. We are going to go ahead and get started here. Before we do so, we'd just like to chat about a few housekeeping items. I'd like to first welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation on using cameras to understand Bainbridge Island wildlife. So before we dive in, just a few details. If you haven't already, please be sure to mute yourselves now. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, please type and submit your question in the chat bar and send it to everyone. At the time of the Q&A, I will call your name, at which point you can unmute yourself to ask your questions. Questions will be read in chronological order. From the Land Trust, you'll hear from Gina King, our wildlife biologist. From Woodland Park Zoo, you'll hear Dr. Robert Long, Director of the Living Northwest Conservation Program, and Katie Remine, Coordinator for Living Northwest Conservation Program. We'd also like to just take a moment to thank the Bainbridge Community Foundation for their incredibly generous support of this project, and Woodland Park Zoo for their collaboration and expertise. And so now I would like to turn this over to Robert. And Robert, you should have remote control access.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me okay, and I'm going to make sure I do have remote control access before I start talking. It's a little slow before. Can you all hear me okay, first of all?
Yes.
Okay. Matt, I don't seem to have remote control access. Oh, there we go. I got it. Okay, great. I think we're set. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about wildlife here on Bainbridge Island, and I'm going to start by introducing you to a project that Woodland Park Zoo started in early 2019 called the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. It's going to be, we're going to talk a little more about how that project fits in with some of what Bainbridge Island Land Trust has been doing recently. And the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project is a collaboration between Woodland Park Zoo and Seattle University. So we started it a few years ago to look at wildlife in and around Greater Seattle. Now, I'm a conservation scientist, and I spend a lot of my time in the backcountry in really wild areas studying animals like wolverines. But increasingly, wildlife like coyotes, raccoons, opossums, deer are being seen and occurring more and more in suburban, exurban, and even urban areas. And increasingly, sightings are even happening in very urban areas, places like New York. This is a shot from a train in Portland of a coyote, and even in Chicago. So wildlife are starting to make themselves a little more comfortable around people. And a lot of this talk is going to talk about how we can try to coexist better with wildlife. Seattle is an urban area, but it's also very green, as you know. And as you get towards the exurbs, or here on Bainbridge Island, which is actually where I live, it's quite green and forested. I'm looking out at a forest right now, right out my window. And so we started this project, the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project, to try to look at wildlife in and around Seattle and to ask some questions about how we coexist. The project staff include myself, Mark Jordan from Seattle University, Katie Remine, who you'll hear from in a little bit, and Paula McKay, also with Woodland Park Zoo. Now, when I say carnivores, we're talking about some of the medium and larger carnivores that occur here in Washington. And I don't mean just meat eaters. So carnivore also means a particular taxonomic group, the order Carnivora, which is a mammal group, including the bears, so black bears, bobcats and cougars, coyotes, red foxes, river otters, and raccoons. And then we also have the opossum, which is not really a carnivore, it's a marsupial, but we're giving it an honorary carnivore slot in this project because it does occur in some of the same areas where these other species occur. Now, the project goals are actually fourfold. One is really to engage the local human community around what lives around them, what types of wildlife do we have here in our region, and then increasing our understanding of carnivores and their ecological relationship near people. And then finally, using some of what we learned to develop better strategies for coexistence. And then finally, for collaborating with other organizations and agencies like the Bainbridge Island Land Trust or the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife around wildlife issues. Now, one of the methods we use, the primary method we use, are remote cameras, also known as camera traps. And these we put on trees out in green spaces, hedgerows, parks, and even some residences. And the protocols we use are based on a North American-wide project based out of Lincoln Park Zoo that is collecting data from cities. I think the number is around 32 cities right now across North America, so that we can pool our data and have a better chance of understanding how wildlife in different cities are co-occurring with people. And we're camera trapping along a couple of transects. Here are the transects that we're using in Greater Seattle. They start in some of the very urban areas and run along a gradient of human development and density out towards basically the foothills of the Cascades. And you'll also see we have some off-transect sites, including 4 stations here on Bainbridge, which you'll hear a little more about in a bit. And we have had really great success since early 2019 with these cameras that we've put out. And this is just a histogram of the number of detections of the different species that we have seen on our camera traps. Everything from squirrels down to coyotes right there in the middle, kind of a middle detected animal, and then down to even bobcats and black bears. Or this. We get camera trap photos at fairly urban sites. These are all photos from very small green spaces, either small patches of trees or hedgerows or people's backyards in suburban and urban sites. So quite a few raccoons, as you might expect, opossums, coyotes. And then our more wild sites, we also get coyotes, but we get black bears at our camera stations, bobcats there on the lower left, and even the lower right, that's a flying squirrel, which we occasionally get on our cameras. This one actually captured flying, which is very uncommon. So our camera traps are, I'm going to go back just a second before I talk about this. Our camera traps, we actually recruit volunteer teams to manage those camera traps. So we are engaging the community in that way around actually putting the camera traps out, revisiting them, seeing what visits, and then bringing the data in and getting it to us for analysis. Another way that anyone can participate is through the Zooniverse platform. And if you go to that link at the bottom, and this will be recorded, so you can go back to this slide, you'll be able to look at a lot of these camera trap photos and code them yourself. So put what species you're seeing on the screen. And this helps us keep up with our data flow and classify these images so that we can get the results out as fast as possible. In addition to the camera trap component, we developed a reporting site called Carnivore Spotter. And this site lets anyone report carnivore sightings in their neighborhoods, at their houses, at their place of work, or when they're moving about doing their daily business. You can also visit this site and see reports that have been made. And this is a scatter of all the reports. You can see that we had over 5,000 as of early this year. So we have quite a few more. And you can look at them by species, neighborhood, time of sighting, and zoom in and see what's going on around you. Here are a few images that have been submitted as part of Carnivore Spotter. So some really interesting ones, coyotes walking by people's pools and bobcats on roofs and things like that. So it's a really exciting way. And you can see some of these photos also on the Carnivore Spotter site. We've had quite a bit of press, and if you do some searches online, you'll probably find some articles about the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. And then lastly, we are also contributing our data, as I mentioned, to this continent-wide, North American-wide project. And right now we have 3 different projects that we're contributing to. One looking at socioeconomic factors and how that influences where wildlife exists. Some COVID-related studies to look at how the shutdown, the human shutdown last year affected wildlife movement. And then a few other projects where we're contributing data to large nationwide analyses. And then lastly, I want to mention we have a new, we're collaborating with the University of Washington, a graduate student. And Sammy Kraling is going to be looking at coyote diet, and there's an opportunity to volunteer there if you want to try to collect some scats, samples to send to Sammy so that she can analyze that. And we're trying to get a better sense of what coyotes actually eat in much of the greater Seattle area. So that's one of our newest projects. You can see that Seattle Coyote Study website. So that's what we have going on with the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project. You're going to hear a lot more about how that's happening here on Bainbridge Island next. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Robert. I'd like to turn things over to Gina. Gina King is our wildlife biologist here at the Bainbridge Island Land Trust. And Gina, you should have access to the presentation, and take it away.
All right, thank you, Matt. So I'm just going to start with a quick overview of who we are for folks who aren't familiar with us and our work. The Bainbridge Island Land Trust, it's a nonprofit. It was founded in 1989. And what we do is we conserve land on the island. And we do this with an emphasis on protecting shorelines and then the interior habitat networks. And we do this through 2 main mechanisms, through conservation easements, which are the kind of striped areas on this map. Private lands permanently protect conservation values on those lands, or through acquisitions by ourselves or with partners. We'll actually buy lands. That's the dark green on this map. And then the really bright colors are our stand for land properties. And then we'll either hold on to those lands ourselves or we'll transfer them to the Parks Department to manage. So through those mechanisms, we've protected over 1,400 acres. We hold 188 ourselves. That'll be over 200 once we're all done with Stand for the Land campaign here. So when we hold on to a property, we always prepare a detailed management plan so that guides our actions, so it will protect those conservation values into the future. And of course, first we need to know, what those values are, what it is that we're trying to protect. And we've found that these remote cameras are really a valuable inventory tool, especially for mammals. These cameras work really well. And I'm going to use this example of one of our Stand for the Land properties. This is the Miller-Kirkman Preserve. And you can see here we put out 4 cameras in different kinds of habitats on this preserve. And I'm going to show you a couple of the cameras there. So this estuary camera is really cool. It's in Little Manzanita Bay. And at high tide, you get, waterfowl and those kinds of species. And here we had 70 common mergansers all foraging together in front of our camera. And then at low tide, you have these mud flats, and you get species like raccoons foraging around and young coyotes playing, and great blue herons. And then we had river otters. So we had a mom and her pups, and then this group of 7 probably bachelors running through here in front of our camera. And then just up from the estuary, in the riparian zone, we have a nice little side-by-side comparison of all 3 of the squirrel species we have on the island. We have the non-native eastern gray squirrel, and you see our native Doug squirrel. It's much smaller. And we even got flying squirrel at this site, which is a very cool one. And, other critters up to the size of raccoon and down to little deer mice. This one location. So then we'll take this information, and here we have an icon representing each of the species we saw at each of these camera sites. And we'll combine that with other kinds of inventory methods, and gives us really good information of what we're managing for on each of these properties. We've also noticed some kind of interesting behaviors and interactions on these cameras. So on that Miller-Kirkman Preserve, I put one camera on a thatch ant mound, just curious to see what uses those. And it was interesting, we kept getting these groups of crows coming down and kind of hunkering down on these mounds. And it turns out that they do that on purpose to irritate the ants to release their formic acid on the bird's feathers. And that helps to keep the feathers clean and healthy. And that's actually called anting. It's actually a verb, anting. We also caught this coyote carrying an enormous possum over on Meg's Park and Farm. And then back on Miller-Kirkman, we watched a possum carrying a bundle of leaves with its tail, which they use to line their little dens. So we know it's denning nearby. Also on Miller-Kirkman, this poor raccoon was caught out in the open when a coyote came wandering through, and it did the only thing it could do, which was to hunker down, which fortunately worked for it. It walked off after the coyote left here. So lots of really interesting things that you capture on these cameras. We've also done a little bit more rigorous work with our cameras. So we worked with UW Environmental Studies capstone students to do a couple of studies on the effects of trails on wildlife. So they looked at the question of how wildlife detections vary between trails used by people and then locations with very little human use. And this just shows how the students who did the work in 2019 laid out their cameras in 3 different time periods across the wildlife corridor and Meg's Park and Farm, setting some on trails used by people and then some in more remote locations. And both of those studies came up with pretty similar results, that they had higher wildlife detection rates and more species diversity at the sites here that had very little human use. So it was kind of interesting because even though we don't have things like wolverines on the island, we do find that there seem to be effects of human disturbance, and kind of helps us to frame up our management and the importance of keeping some low disturbance refugia for wildlife on our preserves. So it was about the time that we were working with those 2018, 2019 students that Robert approached us about that Seattle Urban Carnivore project, and about maybe maintaining some of these long-term camera sites for that project on our properties. And we just jumped in on he has one of these sites at his home in this area. We added a couple of sites on preserves that we were already kind of monitoring with cameras. So we did one at the wildlife corridor here and down at the Cougar Creek Preserve. Unfortunately, once we lost our UW students, it became increasingly difficult to manage the camera sites and all of the images coming in. So we worked with the zoo to apply for a Bainbridge Community Foundation grant. So that is a grant to help us build a base of trained volunteers to help us manage those Seattle urban carnivore stations, add another station to that effort, and then to help us to identify the species that we're getting on those photos and assist on some of our own stations on our properties, like I talked about earlier, where we put more cameras to learn about what's on our particular properties. And we're fortunate enough to secure that grant. So I'm gonna let Matt take over and talk a little bit about the volunteers there.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. So as Gina said, we were fortunate enough, thanks to the support from the Bainbridge Community Foundation, to partner with Woodland Park Zoo and bring this project over onto Bainbridge Island officially. So from December to January, through January of 2021, we recruited volunteers from the community. Each volunteer was assigned to a team. There were 3 teams total to indicate the 3 properties in which we were setting up sites: Wildlife Corridor, Cougar Creek Preserve, and of course, Rockaway Bluff Preserve. And so each team has a team leader and then team members. And the team leader is responsible for coordinating and communicating with their team members to organize monthly camera checks and the processing of these SD cards. In turn, helping out with the land trust, collect additional images, and it's a great way to see, what some of the wildlife species are that are utilizing each of these properties. It's been incredibly engaging and interactive to work with our volunteers and community members through this project. We've even been fortunate enough to have a family, an island family, lead one of our stations in conjunction with another volunteer, Christine. And the Gilbert family has been leading the Wildlife Corridor property camera. It's been a pleasure to work with them. And we'd like to provide the Gilbert family with an opportunity to speak about the project in some of their own words.
So Lucas and I have really enjoyed our time with the camera traps at the Wildlife Corridor site. And what have you most enjoyed about it, Lucas?
Looking at the pictures of the coyotes, because coyotes are so fun.
Yeah, and it's so fun, that moment where we take the memory chip, the memory card, and we put it in the laptop, and it's like, what are we gonna see? It's always like a surprise, and it's fun, the anticipation of that. And then it's also fun to just spend time in the forest and in nature with my family and with our other volunteer, Christine, and seeing every month. We started in, I think, January, and every month seeing the seasons change and the forest change is pretty cool. We got some great pictures of a coyote who got really curious about the scent lure that was on the tree across from the camera and was rubbing against it and pulled the lure off. And it was cute how frisky and playful that coyotes can be.
So we've had some incredibly interesting observations at our SUCP stations, and I'll let Gina speak more about that.
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough that at both of the stations that we had going back when we had the bears on the island back in 2018 and 19, we saw those at both our Cougar Creek and Wildlife Corridor stations. And do I have control? Here we go. This was very cool. Okay, so this was the first time our Cougar Creek volunteer team went out and pulled their card and looked at what they had. They actually got a cougar right there at Cougar Creek. I almost felt bad for them because it's like, guys, it might be downhill from here. but it was really exciting to get these detections, especially when you consider these are like the largest carnivores that we get on the island, and we're all about protecting habitat networks. And to have these, using our preserve kind of shows that we do still have some intact habitat networks out there. Let's see. So our Rockaway Bluff Preserve team they actually had, this is so funny because a barred owl not only walks in front of a camera during the day, but it had an identifiable color band on its leg. And so we got in touch with the fellow Jamie Acker who does the owl banding on the island. He said, oh yeah, I know that guy. He was juvenile 2008. So this is a 13-year-old male who has nested nearby this site. And then this is what our delightful wildlife corridor team were talking about with their little coyote, Frisky with the scent lure. So yeah, and just to talk about what we're going to do next on this project, we're going to, try to continue those sites. There's supposed to be, permanent long-term monitoring at those Seattle Urban Carnivore project sites. As Robert mentioned, you can see these images at Zooniverse. And if you're interested in participating in some of our future efforts on more of these camera traps or reviewing photos, please email Matt and we'll add you to the list to rope you in as soon as we can.
Thanks, Gina. Now we are going to turn things back over to Katie Vermine of Woodland Park Zoo. Katie, you should have remote control access.
Great, thanks so much. Let me give that a try. Always seems to take a minute for it to kick in. Is it going? No, it's not going.
Nope.
Not going for me for some reason, but I don't have that many slides, so you can just advance it and we'll go from there. So we've talked a little bit about how we use these photos. Let me give up remote control. There you go. We've talked a little bit about how, the kind of data that we're getting from these photos, and Gina talked about using the information to help with management plans for different properties. But one of the project goals is also to really think about how we coexist with these urban carnivores. So to start us off with that, I'd love if you all could use the chat, and I'm going to challenge you to use 1 to 5 words to tell us a little bit about what does human wildlife, or human carnivore, if you want to be specific, what does coexistence mean to you? I'd love to see a few ideas from all of you out there in the chat. And if you need to find the chat, if you put your mouse down towards the bottom of the screen, there's a little chat box you can click on. And you can open that up and type a few words in there. So we'll give you just a minute to do that. So what does human wildlife coexistence or human carnivore coexistence mean for you? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Great, that's so great. Thank you. I'll give you one more minute here to share. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of kind of trends about thinking about each other, like being a good neighbor, and some trade-off, right? Like making sure that equal opportunity, respecting each other, enough habitat for them, appreciating them, health for them and health for us, right? So it's definitely about, for me, it's definitely about respecting the fact that, people have needs to survive and thrive, and wildlife have needs to survive and thrive. And so for me, like for a lot of you, that coexistence really means how can we all meet our needs and survive and thrive? So we wanted to provide a couple of examples, and we definitely will have time in the Q&A to talk a little more about coexistence. But we've been working for the last few years on a different grant project out in Issaquah with some community members there on this idea of coexistence and how to support human wildlife coexistence in their community. And our community volunteers out there came up with some tips. And last year when everything shut down with the pandemic, they noted that everyone was out walking around in their community. So they worked together with the zoo to develop these yard signs with coexistence tips that they put out. Actually, they're out right now around Issaquah. So I wanted to share a couple of those with you. So if you could go one slide forward, Matt. And just show you some examples of some of the tips they came up with, because really these tips are good in any community. So they were thinking about specific species and what tips for coexisting can be helpful for different species. So things like if you have issues with raccoons, you definitely want to think about, what's attracting them to your space. Is it your trash? Is it pet food? So keeping your trash indoors or in wildlife resistant cans, or feeding your pets inside and not leaving that food outside. And next slide. Another species that they were thinking about were coyotes, which I'm sure a lot of you think about too, and how we coexist with coyotes. And so again, with coyotes, pet food can be an attractant, as well as pets themselves. So a good recommendation is to keep your pets inside or leashed or under your control from, during the nighttime, and not letting them be out roaming on their own at night. And that can really prevent, a lot of potential issues that might come up. And then next one, they out in Issaquah have a lot of bobcats. There's a huge number of bobcat observations that we've been getting through Carnivore Spotter, which has been really interesting. And so one of the yard signs they created was about bobcats, but I think one of the points here about using electric fencing or chain link around chicken coops can be helpful with any types of carnivores. And I think Robert, did you want to mention a little bit about bobcats and whether they are or are not on Bainbridge Island?
Well, they certainly could reach Bainbridge Island. We're very close to the Kitsap Peninsula, which is where we get our black bears occasionally and our cougars. But I haven't seen any signs of bobcats on any of the remote cameras we've used, and I haven't found any records of bobcats on the island. So they certainly don't live here permanently, but they could wander onto the island for sure.
Yeah, we'd definitely be interested if you see them and get photos, put those on Carnivore Spotter for sure. And then next slide. And just because, you occasionally have that cougar visiting, some of these tips are also helpful for cougars. And if you're interested in these signs and these messages, these signs and messages, as well as a whole social media toolkit that the Issaquah volunteers developed, is available at zoo.org/coexisting. And you can download the signs, you can download the social media toolkit. It has messages you can use to send to your neighbors. So if you're not sure, if you want to help your neighbors coexist, but you're not sure, how to approach sharing those messages, these might have some good ideas. The social media toolkit might have some good ideas. And it also has linked images, because we all know that people love to see photos of animals, right? Especially on social media. So, but really the main point about, these messages and about coexisting is really that it's kind of up to us as individuals, but also as communities. So, the actions that we take or don't take can really help with promoting positive coexistence with wildlife and that respectful balance and taking care of each other that you all mentioned in your comments. So finally, with the next slide, we just wanted to tell a little story to highlight one point about keeping wildlife wild. So this was an article in the Seattle Times about Buttons the elk, who now lives with the elk herd at Woodland Park Zoo, but was a wild elk over in Eastern Washington. And for whatever reason, Buttons initially was very comfortable with people, and then people started feeding Buttons, and Buttons got very comfortable with people to the extent that it was not safe for people or for the elk. And so Buttons, as much as Department of Fish and Wildlife tried, different situations, Buttons just wasn't successfully living in the wild as a wild elk. And so Buttons living with our herd at the zoo, which is great, but I think we would all prefer if Buttons, was still in the wild. And so sometimes our caring for wildlife, we see an animal that we think needs help, and sometimes our caring can actually lead to situations that are not as good for the animals if they get too familiar and too comfortable with people. So if you see wildlife or you encounter wildlife that you think need help, we definitely recommend using your local resources like West Sound Wildlife Shelter. Check out their website. They have a lot of great information on what to do with different kinds of animals and what they can and can't help with. There's some species that they might be able to help with and some situations they can't, but they're a great resource for that. So that's really, we just wanted to kind of put those things out there to start some conversation about coexisting. And if you go to the next slide, Matt, I'll just wrap that section up. And remember that, yeah, you can add your observations to Carnivore Spotter. You can help to code these photos on Zooniverse. And if you know a neighborhood group or community group that you feel like would really benefit from further conversation or a presentation like this, you can definitely reach out to the Seattle Urban Carnivore Project, and we'd be happy to talk with other groups. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. We'd now like to open the meeting up for Q&A. If you have a question, please type it in the chat bar and I will call on you in chronological order. We're going to start with Jennifer. If you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Yeah, first, thanks so much. This was super interesting and I really appreciate it. One of the things I like about Bainbridge is how many different unique environments there are. So I'm curious if there are types of environment that you don't currently have covered by your camera traps that you wish you did.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And I think one kind of habitat that we've managed to put a camera on just briefly was a pond. And we got such interesting things in that pond, especially as the water level raised and lower and a log became exposed and then submerged. And I'd love to get like a full year's information on a number of ponds. I think it'd be really interesting. I think like something along shoreline could be pretty interesting too, if you could figure out a way to do that where it's not constantly triggered by all of the things that happen on a shoreline, but maybe, up against the bluff would be kind of interesting to see what uses that habitat too. And maybe something more of an open meadow, because what we've had is mostly within like forest habitat and long streams. So yeah, that would be really interesting.
Thank you, Jennifer. So our next question is from Shannon. Shannon, would you mind unmuting yourself to ask your question?
Hi there. Nice of you to take my question. I have a neighbor who feeds the raccoons and I've asked them to stop. They are coming on my property now more and more that it's the babies are getting bigger. And I had one in here the other day. I have a little fish pond on my deck with just little feeder fish in it, but I have to cover it every night. Otherwise they come in and try to catch them. So is there anything we can do? Is there any way I can guide those people to stop? Thank you.
I can take that one and others can jump in if they want, but yeah, I know it's, and I think people, they care about the wildlife, right? And so that's coming from a place of empathy and caring. So, and you care about wildlife. So I think often it's just about connecting around that common kind of value, or, that's the outcome you want, is that the animal will be healthy and have a great life. And so, possibly explaining or sharing some information about, where that could lead to down the road. If the raccoons are habituated getting food from people, that could lead to negative interactions, which could lead to, a not great outcome, usually more for the raccoons than for people, but it could be for either, right? So, if you can strike up a conversation and find that common value, that could be a good starting point.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Shannon. So our next question is from Karen. Karen, would you mind unmuting yourself to ask your question?
I'm wondering if the cougar has been recently spotted.
Matt, you want to start?
Yeah, I will answer this question to the best of my knowledge. You know, of course, Bainbridge Island is a tight-knit community, and observations of one species are communicated throughout the greater community. So to the best of my knowledge and from the latest information from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the cougar has not been spotted on island recently. I believe the last sighting of a cougar, and we're not even sure that this was the same cougar, was around Bremerton, and that was at least a few months ago. But Robert, you probably have more accurate information.
No, that's basically what I was going to say, that there haven't been any verified sightings that I know of since right around that time in February or March. And that's really what we wanted to happen. You know, it was really unfortunate that a couple of goats were killed by that cougar early on. I'm not sure about a sheep. I know there were some livestock killed, and I think what happened was people responded the way that we hoped they would. They secured those livestock. They started to bring them in at night. All things that are recommended in places where cougars exist. And I think Bainbridge is interesting because we're right on the edge. We probably don't have any cougars that live on the island year round. It's often years between when cougars probably visit, but they do visit. So we do live in cougar country. And so once those livestock were secured, I think the cougar probably moved on and either swam off the island or ran across the bridge. We're not sure, but that's really the outcome we were hoping for. And it's usually what happens with cougars when they get into situations like this and are given the opportunity to move off.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Karen. So our next question is from Christina. Christina, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks. This has been really fun. I had a question to y'all about what might have surprised you about the data that you gathered, and what will you do with it?
Thanks, Christina. I think as far as what was actually surprising to me so far, I think I would go back to that pond example. So it was the pond at Cougar Creek. And I was kind of amazed at the diversity of animals using that one little log on the pond that we're seeing, you know, there's raccoons and deer go through there, and like herons and mink and like Cooper's hawk and barred owl, and just the incredible diversity of things in that pond edge habitat. And as you know, pond habitats on Bainbridge, actually there are, you know, they tend to be man-made ponds. They tend to have highly managed edges in a lot of, you know, on a lot of private lands. And it really makes me curious about, you know, how significant these habitats are, and maybe how we could manage those better.
I'll just add, you know, what are we going to do with the data now that we're collecting it? I think it's a really, it's an amazing project in that we can use these data at so many different levels. The information that we gather can be used right here on the island to think about trail systems and how we coexist, dogs on and off leash, things like that. And then we're contributing data to these really large projects looking continental wide, how the COVID shutdowns affected wildlife and how wildlife might move around when people are out on the landscape, when they're not driving, when they are driving. So the information we're gathering just has so many different directions it can go, and people and organizations and studies it can be shared with. So it's really pretty valuable.
Thank you for your question. So this next question, which is, it's a great question, one of my favorite animals. Judy, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for this. I was told that there's a beaver pond by SUCP School, and I'm just curious about that. Has anybody heard of beaver on the island?
Should take that one.
This is Terry from Stillwater's in Kingston. I'm not on Bainbridge Island, but we definitely have beaver up Carpenter Creek.
And there are.
Oh, sorry, did you want to go ahead, Robert?
No, go ahead, Jeannie.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. The awkward thing about Zoom, right? Yeah, so on Bainbridge Island, there's definitely a longstanding beaver colony, fairly longstanding at Meg's Park and Farm. And then through that whole creek system, they've been moving to a few other sites along that, like Murden Creek and can't remember what it's called, and all the various tributaries, but they definitely are moving within that system. And then at Islandwood, Christina could speak to that too, that they have a beaver colony. I don't know how long you guys have had those, but they definitely have some.
Yeah, we have a lot of beaver activity at Max Pond, and well, gosh, I've been there almost 16 years, right? And until maybe about a year ago, 2 years ago, we didn't see any beavers there. I kept reading reports that like the very last beaver was killed on 305. I would read this all the time, the very last one. And I was like, oh, poor beavers, because it's a native animal. And then I don't know, they just sort of magically pop up. They're like unicorns. And I don't know how they, if they ever really went away, I don't know how they get back, but yeah, they do. And we have a ton of, beaver trees around Max Pond right now. And I know they were causing our facilities department a lot of headaches because they were biting through the cable for our floating classroom on Max Pond. And I don't know why they were doing that. I thought they were just being rascals, but I love the beavers. I'm so happy to see them and the little beaver babies, whatever they're called. They're so cute.
Great, thank you. That's exciting.
Thank you, Judy. So our next question is from Bob. Bob has a question about river otters and bald eagles.
Hi, thank you. I live over in the Manitou Park area, and we see river otters come up from Murden Cove, and they come up the big trench that the city digs for flooding, I guess. And then it comes down Manitou Park, goes up our driveway into the pond. There's about 3 or 4 ponds in the Falk Road area and Manitou Park area. And they're looking for duck eggs, because we always have nesting mallard ducks up in the reeds. And there's such a diversity of habitat in that area. It also attracts raccoons. But the otters are primarily looking for eggs. And then we have a problem with across the street, there is a bald eagle's nest. And yes, they gather lots of fish, but they also gather lots of domestic cats too. And I don't know of any way to slow it down. I mean, there are some feral cats, but most of them people have. But I mean, we see coyotes during the day, and they're very happy to take a cat or a rabbit or something like that during the day, and they're very healthy. I mean, they aren't thin, you can't see the ribs or anything. So it's, I'm not quite sure what, if anything, I can do other than this particular pond might be a candidate for a camera, only because of the diversity of the wildlife that is using that pond. It drains out to basically wet mud during the summer. And my neighbor, Charles Schmidt, and I sort of keep track of what's happening in the pond. But it's very diverse wildlife.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
Go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say thanks, Bob, for those anecdotes and those reports. Yeah, and I'll just say a little about coyotes to start with. People often express that they think Bainbridge is now too developed for coyotes, but coyotes are really adaptable, and areas like this that have a lot of forest still and then an interspersion of different food types are pretty ideal for coyotes. And they do have a lot of access to both natural prey like squirrels and rabbits, berries, and then they do actually access human garbage and things like that. One of the reasons we started the diet project that I mentioned earlier is we're trying to really get a handle on what coyotes are targeting in different areas for their food. A lot of times people suspect they take a lot of cats, but there haven't been that many studies looking at really the number of domestic animals coyotes take. And we see cats over and over again on our cameras right before and after, within hours of coyotes, and we see them repeatedly. These cats are surviving. So I think people have this sense that if a cat gets out, it's automatically going to be dead from a coyote, and I'm not quite sure that's accurate. We've actually seen video of cats chasing coyotes right down the road. Cats can be formidable, and coyotes are smaller than I think some people think. So, but we are hoping to look at that, and certainly pets are something that people should secure, because coyotes will occasionally attack animals for different reasons.
Well, I think we've actually lost more cats to bald eagles than we have to coyotes. And down at Manitou Beach and Manitou Park Road, a tree came down, and when it came down with the eagle's nest, I mean, there were 7 or 8 cat collars in it.
Okay, yeah, it'd be interesting to look at that too. Bald eagles are opportunistic. They do focus on fish, but they'll eat gulls, like seagulls as well, and other small mammals. They can't pick up as much and fly as a lot of people think. They're limited by what they can actually pick up and fly with. So it's also possible bald eagles are scavengers. And one of the biggest sources of cat mortality anywhere is vehicles, human vehicles. So it could be that bald eagles are scavenging cats as well. So it really gets complex when you start to try to pick apart what's going on out in nature, just from some observations. But it's really interesting, and it may be a good place to put a camera for sure, to start looking at some of those questions. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Bob. And I believe if others are curious about setting up camera traps on their own properties, we can provide recommendations on options for cameras. Is that right, Robert and Katie?
Yeah, definitely. If you're interested just for your own, interest, we can't take contributions from people's personal camera traps into our project because of the specific protocol we follow. But certainly it's fun to have your own, just to see what's going on in your own backyard as well.
So it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but again, we just want to thank everyone so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. This presentation is recorded, and the link will be made available on the Land Trust YouTube channel. I know some folks had some issues with connectivity, but rest assured we will get that video up on the presentation, and we will send it out to everyone if you'd like to share it with others in the community. But thank you so much. And if you have any other questions about the project or even volunteer opportunities, feel free to get in touch with myself. I can send my email contact to everyone out. But thank you again.
Yeah, and thanks for having us, and to all the volunteers too.
Yeah, definitely. Huge thanks to the volunteers.
Hope to see everyone out there on the trails.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.